Shadows over Red Marsh Plantation in the oppressive heat of July 1847. The Red Marsh Plantation sat like a festering wound in the lowlands of South Carolina, its brick chimneys puffing smoke that mingled with the humid air. From the edge of the dense cypress forest, the main house looked picturesque enough. A whitewashed facade, neatly trimmed hedges, and a sweeping veranda, but appearances were a cruel disguise. Behind those walls, the rhythm of suffering beat with an unrelenting cadence, orchestrated by its mistress, Dr. Selina Whitmore. Selina, widow of a wealthy merchant, had inherited Red Marsh along with the 30 enslaved people who labored under its oppressive sun. From the beginning, she viewed them not as humans but as instruments of observation, specimens for study in the emerging science of heredity and physical perfection. Unlike the typical overseers who drove their slaves with threats and whips, Selina's cruelty was methodical, almost clinical. She preferred to manipulate rather than punish, to observe rather than comfort. To her, every malnourished child, every fevered body was data, a point in a grand experiment no one else could conceive. Thomas Avery arrived at Red Marsh in September of that year. He was 12, an albino boy with hair like spun silver and eyes so pale they seemed almost translucent. His mother had been sold after a failed attempt to flee the county, leaving Thomas alone in the world, and the overseer who delivered him to Red Marsh treated him with the same indifference one might reserve for an unwanted shipment of goods. Selina, however, saw in Thomas a rare opportunity. She had long studied the writings of European physiologists and eugenic theorists, and here before her stood a living example of the traits she wished to isolate and examine. She decided immediately that he would be her primary subject. From the moment he arrived, Thomas's life was stripped of agency. He was placed in a small, sparsely furnished room at the back of the main house, a single window overlooking the swampy forest that bordered the property. There he would spend hours reading from a selection of texts Selina deemed necessary. Anatomy books, breeding manuals, and agricultural treatises, all chosen to familiarize him with the scientific vocabulary she intended him to adopt. The girl slaves, Eliza, Sarah, and Hannah, were assigned as his caretakers and companions, though they were not spared Selina's scrutiny. She recorded every interaction, noting compliance, resistance, and subtle expressions of fear or defiance in meticulous detail. Selina's journals from those early months are almost unbearable to read. One entry from October 2, 1847, describes her observation of Thomas watching Eliza carry water. Subject demonstrates heightened attention when observing coordinated manual activity. Pupils dilated, minimal expression on face, emotional response neutral, compliance optimal for age and condition. To the uninitiated, this might seem clinical, but the language belies the horror. Every word records not a child, but a test subject being measured, analyzed, and mentally catalogued for experiments whose full scope would only later emerge. By winter, Selina began introducing what she called the social conditioning phase. The children were made to work together in exhausting routines designed to desensitize them to suffering. They cleaned, prepared meals, and tended to the sick, all under Selina's watchful eyes. Failures to follow instructions, no matter how minor, were met not with physical punishment alone, but with psychological manipulation, isolation, public humiliation, and subtle threats, implying that disobedience could result in permanent removal from the main house. It was during one of these early winter months that Thomas first witnessed the cruelty in its full form. Sarah, barely 16, had been caught attempting to sneak a portion of bread to a younger child. Selina, demonstrating her methodical approach, made her kneel in the cold dining hall while the other girls were forced to watch. She catalogued every reaction, trembling hands, reddened eyes, a lip quivering slightly as Sarah attempted to speak. No one spoke for her. When Thomas glanced at the door, he noticed Selina's journal clutched tightly in her hands, every word she wrote shaping the next step of her experiment. Eliza, on the other hand, showed early signs of resistance. She had been at Red Marsh for 3 years and understood the unspoken rules of survival. Her compliance was careful, measured, but beneath the obedience, Selina noticed a spark, what she would later describe in her journal as latent defiance potential. It was subtle, a frown here, a hesitation there, but to Selina it was data she could not ignore. Eliza became both caretaker and subject, monitored with the same clinical detachment as Thomas himself. The months stretched into a rhythm of quiet terror. Thomas spent his days in his room, reading and memorizing, recording observations under Selina's guidance, though he did not yet understand the purpose. The girls tended him reluctantly, their faces pale with fear, their bodies thin from inadequate rations and forced labor. Selina's journals from January 1008, 148 reveal her fascination with the interplay of trauma and development. Subject 0 exhibits remarkable retention despite stress. Emotional suppression evident. Repetitive conditioning continues, likely to produce predictable behavioral outcomes in months to come. Even in these early notes, the clinical language masks a growing moral atrocity. Then came Selina's most ambitious plan, to begin what she termed the heredity phase, by orchestrating pairings among her human subjects to observe the inheritance of specific traits. She chose the three girls Eliza, Sarah, and Hannah, and Thomas as the first generation of this experiment. She documented every step with obsessive precision: conception probabilities, gestation periods, expected outcomes. The girls were instructed, coerced, and watched constantly. Any resistance was catalogued, and repeated attempts to flee were met with swift punishment. Thomas, though too young to fully understand the purpose, began to grasp the implications. He could see the patterns in Selina's behavior, the obsession with traits, the cold calculations replacing empathy, the way suffering was not only tolerated but used as a tool. Each day, he resolved silently to survive, to preserve some fragment of himself untouched by Selina's manipulations. He read obsessively, studied anatomy diagrams, and noted discrepancies in Selina's predictions wherever he could. Winter faded into spring, and with it, the first signs of pregnancy emerged among the girls. Selina recorded each moment with meticulous care, discussing expected outcomes, physical measurements, and potential deviations from theory. But nature, as it always does, had its own course. Not all the girls conceived, and those who did experienced profound distress. Eliza's growing belly was a visible testament to the cruel calculations imposed upon her, and Thomas watched silently, understanding the depth of suffering that awaited them all. By the time the first child was expected, Red Marsh Plantation had become a chamber of quiet dread. The forests around the estate seemed to absorb the screams, the silence of the swampy nights echoing the despair within the walls. Thomas, Sarah, and Hannah had learned the unspoken rules of survival, compliance, observation, and emotional suppression. Eliza, however, bore the weight of what was to come with a visible and growing grief, and Thomas understood, even in those early days, that this was a test not only of the body but of the soul. The final journal entries from spring 1008, 148 hint at what Selina believed would be the triumph of her experiment, yet for anyone reading them today, the true horror lies not in her scientific notes but in the lives catalogued and measured for her ambitions. Every observation, every diagram, every precise notation represents a human being denied freedom, stripped of dignity, and reduced to a statistic in a cruel and calculated pursuit of knowledge. And so, Red Marsh Plantation continued its relentless cycle, the sweltering heat and the humid air thick with both mosquitoes and the unspoken terror of those within. Selina Whitmore, mistress of data and despair, had begun an experiment that would mark the lives of every child, woman, and man in her dominion, a shadow over the lowlands that would not soon fade. The heredity phase begins by the early summer of 1848. The oppressive heat of South Carolina had settled into a sticky rhythm, pressing down on Red Marsh Plantation like a constant, invisible weight. The swampy air carried the scent of decay and waterlogged soil, and the cries of cicadas mixed with the muffled sounds from the main house, a house that had become less a home and more a laboratory of suffering. Selina Whitmore had moved from observation into active experimentation, and the plantation's human occupants were now fully ensnared in her vision of scientific progress. The girls, Eliza, Sarah, and Hannah, were now carefully monitored for signs of conception. Selina had established rigid schedules, meals at precise intervals, physical examinations twice daily, and constant note, taking on every physical change. Thomas, still barely 13, was tasked with documenting the results under Selina's relentless supervision. He felt the weight of each pen stroke as if his own conscience were being recorded alongside the girls' bodies. Selina's obsession was meticulous. She compared facial features, hand lengths, and even the precise shape of fingernails against the diagrams in her European textbooks. She wrote in her journals with a fervor that made the air of the main house almost suffocating. Subject Eliza exhibits first signs of gestation. Observed slight change in complexion and abdominal contour. Emotional stability maintained. Compliance rating high. Anticipated delivery early March. 1849. All measures in place to ensure maximum viability of specimen. Reading such entries today, one sees not a woman chronicling life, but an architect of human despair counting souls like livestock. The first pregnancy came under Selina's vigilant gaze. Eliza's body, once slender and strong from years of labor, began to swell, and Selina's inspections grew invasive. She measured the developing child in precise weeks, sometimes using calipers to gauge limb growth. When Eliza winced or cried out from discomfort, Selina recorded it clinically. Subject shows physiological distress, emotional response suppressed, no lasting resistance noted. Thomas, forced to observe, felt a silent terror. He wanted to look away, but knew that any hesitation would be noted and punished. Hannah, quieter and more withdrawn, began to show signs of fear. She refused eye contact during inspections, lowered her voice when speaking, and increasingly avoided physical tasks that required her to pass near Selina. Thomas noticed how she flinched at every sudden movement, how her body seemed to shrink even in the heat. Selina noted it too, not as concern but as data. Hannah, stress markers elevated, pupillary dilation inconsistent, may require adjustment in conditioning protocol. The irony, Thomas realized with a hollow dread, was that the very survival of the girls depended on their ability to internalize cruelty as routine. Selina's methods extended beyond observation. She began introducing mild chemical interventions, herbs and tonics she claimed would improve gestational outcomes. None were tested outside the plantation, and the doses were calculated based on Selina's own conjecture. Some caused nausea, others induced early contractions, but all were meticulously recorded. The girls learned quickly to hide pain or suffer silently. It was safer to feign compliance than to be subjected to further experimentation. Thomas, for his part, wrote down every detail, hiding behind the pretense of dutiful labor while mentally cataloging every sign of abuse. Despite the controlled regimen, nature intervened unpredictably. Sarah miscarried in early July, her body failing under the stress of laborious tasks and inadequate nourishment. Selina was furious, seeing it as a flaw in the subject rather than a consequence of her interventions. She made Thomas rewrite observations 3 times, insisting he account for every variable: temperature, diet, physical exertion, and emotional compliance. Eliza and Hannah, witnessing Sarah's suffering, grew even more fearful. Thomas noticed that their eyes began to carry a quiet desperation, a wordless plea for survival that Selina could never measure or quantify. By late summer, Selina introduced a new layer to the experiment: controlled pairings and reproductive instruction. She spoke to the girls in cold, clinical tones, describing the importance of genetic potential and the need for cooperation with Thomas in observational tasks. The girls had no choice, their bodies already under surveillance, their movements monitored, their every expression recorded. Thomas felt the weight of complicity. He could not stop the events unfolding, yet he bore witness to every violation of human dignity. Hannah's fear intensified. She refused to engage in the work, choosing instead to isolate herself in the corner of the main house, whispering to herself or staring blankly at the walls. Selina noted the behavior as a behavioral anomaly, a deviation that must be corrected. Punishment came swiftly. Hannah was forced to kneel for hours on the cold pine floor, her back raw and blistered by the boards beneath her knees. Thomas, while recording the data, felt his own hands tremble with rage and helplessness. Eliza, too, became compliant out of fear rather than obedience, her face pale and drawn as she performed the tasks Selina demanded. In September, the first pregnancy reached its critical stage. Eliza's labor was supervised by Selina with clinical detachment. Thomas held the lamp as Selina worked, assisting in ways he could not refuse. The child, a small albino infant, was delivered alive, but with visible deformities. Selina's journal recorded the outcome with chilling neutrality. Specimen exhibits expected traits, physical anomalies noted, extremities slightly shortened, cranial measurements within 0. 3 deviation of predicted norms, mortality risk, moderate, nutritional interventions to commence immediately. Thomas looked down at the fragile infant, understanding fully that it had entered a world where its very existence was data, its life an experiment. The following months were a continuous cycle of observation, manipulation, and incremental cruelty. Selina recorded not only physical traits but emotional responses, marking every flinch, tear, or cry as a measurable variable. Thomas kept the books, documenting the expanding catalog of human suffering, powerless to intervene. Eliza's health deteriorated with each successive birth, the nutritional deprivation and psychological strain leaving her frail. Hannah remained withdrawn, her spirit nearly broken, while Sarah's body recovered slowly, but her mind bore invisible scars. Selina's obsession extended even to the small details, how the children responded to sound, light, and touch, the timing of their natural biological rhythms, even the cadence of their breathing during work and rest. Every variance was logged. When one of the infants developed a persistent cough, Selina recorded it meticulously, attributing it to environmental variables rather than the neglect and stress she orchestrated. Thomas realized that the very essence of humanity, the unpredictability of life, was being systematically erased, replaced by controlled measurements and clinical observations. By the end of 1849, Red Marsh Plantation had become a chamber of quiet dread and relentless surveillance. Selina's journals had grown thick with observations, notes, and measurements, each a testament to a mind divorced from empathy. The girls were physically marked by their ordeal, their bodies bearing the proof of experimentation and coercion. Thomas, though young, had become a chronicler of horror, his mind unable to reconcile the atrocities he recorded. Yet within him a fragile sense of morality persisted. He began secretly noting anomalies, places where Selina's predictions failed, moments where nature refused to be controlled. These secret notes were his act of rebellion, a small assertion that human life could not be reduced entirely to data. It was a dangerous act, for discovery would bring punishment not only to him but to the girls. Still, it was the only way Thomas could preserve some vestige of conscience in a world dominated by Selina's cruelty. And so the first phase of Red Marsh's experiments concluded, leaving behind a small generation of children born under the weight of Selina's obsession, their mothers exhausted and fearful, and Thomas bearing silent witness to it all. The horrors of the heredity phase had begun, and yet even greater atrocities lay ahead. Fractures and rebellion. By the spring of 1850, Red Marsh Plantation had become a place defined less by the rhythms of life and more by the cycles of control Selina Whitmore imposed. The girls, Eliza, Hannah, and Sarah, had endured repeated pregnancies, medical examinations, and physical punishments. Their bodies were marked by the relentless demands of Selina's experiment, but their spirits, though battered, still flickered with the faint light of survival. Thomas, now 16, had become both witness and unwilling accomplice, his young mind stretched thin between fear, obedience, and the faint spark of moral outrage. Selina's obsession had shifted to the second generation. The albino child born to Eliza, whom she had named Victor in her journals, had survived the early frailty that had concerned Selina so deeply. Now she scrutinized him daily, noting the growth of his limbs, the color of his hair, and the shape of his skull. Each minute variation was logged, catalogued, and compared to the predictions she had set forth months earlier. Thomas held the lamp during these sessions, recording measurements in shaky handwriting, feeling the weight of every number as a silent indictment of what Selina had done to these children and their mothers. Hannah, who had avoided pregnancy thus far through subterfuge and careful concealment, had begun to resist more openly. She refused tasks assigned by Selina whenever possible, hid in the corners of the main house, and whispered to Thomas in the dead of night about escape. The pair formed a quiet bond, united by shared fear and a secret desire for freedom. Yet the threat of Selina's punishment kept them cautious. The overseers, under Selina's strict instructions, were relentless in surveillance. Every misstep, every whispered conversation, risked brutal reprisal. In the summer of 1850, an unexpected fracture began to emerge within Redmarsh's hierarchy. One of the older enslaved women, Ruth, who had been forced into servitude under Selina's predecessor and now performed heavy labor under the new regime, began openly defying orders. She refused to follow Selina's dietary manipulations, hid food for the pregnant girls, and even attempted to intervene when examinations became too invasive. Selina responded with swift brutality. Ruth was lashed publicly, her back a living map of pain, her cries echoing through the swampy air like a warning to the others. Thomas recorded the event, hands shaking, but also felt something stir. I sensed that resistance, even small, could survive despite the oppression. By fall, tensions reached a boiling point. Eliza, now weakened by repeated pregnancies and the constant physical strain of Selina's regimen, collapsed during an inspection. Selina's response was not concern but calculation. She demanded Thomas measure Eliza's vitals meticulously, noting every irregularity in her pulse, every labored breath, every flicker of weakness. Hannah, seizing the opportunity, attempted to intervene, shielding Eliza from Selina's gaze, but was dragged back by an overseer and punished severely. The message was clear: defiance carried a cost. Yet, amidst these horrors, moments of humanity persisted. Thomas secretly shared food with the girls, whispered encouragement, and tried to distract them with stories of life beyond the plantation. Hannah, in particular, clung to these stories, imagining a world where they might live without constant fear, where children like Victor could grow without being subjects of experimentation. These small acts of kindness became lifelines, fragile threads of resistance woven into the fabric of daily suffering. The second-generation children, now several months old, became both symbols of success and new subjects of Selina's scrutiny. Victor, though physically frail, exhibited an unusually calm temperament that Selina noted with satisfaction. Other children, born to Sarah and eventually Hannah, displayed a mix of health, deformities, and unpredictable traits. Selina's obsession grew. She began comparing behaviors and temperaments, noting emotional responses with the same cold detachment she applied to physical measurements. Thomas, forced to record these observations, felt his conscience fracture further with every entry. Winter brought new hardships. Food became scarce, the swampy air bit through ragged clothing, and illness spread quickly among the young and weakened. Selina's response was methodical and devoid of empathy. She administered her concoctions, measured fevers, and adjusted diets according to her perceived scientific plan. Children died. Eliza lost her second child to fever, Sarah her first. Selina logged each death clinically, marking causes as environmental anomalies or insufficient compliance with protocol, never acknowledging her role in their demise. Thomas hid his grief behind the act of recording, feeling increasingly complicit in the deaths he could not prevent. By the spring of 1851, rebellion began to ferment in subtle ways. Hannah, emboldened by months of secret planning and Thomas's quiet support, attempted small acts of sabotage, spoiling tonics, delaying inspections, whispering misinformation to the overseers. Thomas, caught between fear and morality, reluctantly assisted by creating false logs and subtly altering Selina's records. Eliza, though weakened, began refusing to participate in examinations unless Thomas was present to shield her. The plantation, once entirely under Selina's control, now bore the invisible marks of resistance. Selina, ever vigilant, sensed the change. Her journals began to reflect increasing frustration, subjects exhibiting deviation from protocol, compliance decreasing, psychological conditioning appears insufficient. Consider escalation of disciplinary measures, must maintain control at all costs. Her obsession with maintaining absolute authority drove her to more invasive measures, extended inspections, harsher punishments, and stricter isolation. Yet the human spirit, fragile though it was, continued to resist in quiet, unrecorded ways. The turning point came in June 1851. Hannah, desperate to protect the youngest children, attempted to flee under the cover of darkness. She was caught near the swamp's edge by an overseer and beaten until unconscious. Thomas, hiding in the shadows, witnessed the brutality but could not intervene. The next day, Hannah was returned to the main house, visibly broken but alive. Her resolve, however, remained unshaken. Quietly, she whispered plans of escape and survival to Thomas, her determination igniting a courage in him he did not know he possessed. As the summer of 1851 progressed, the human cost of Selina's experiments became undeniable. Death, disease, and despair marked every corner of Redmarsh. Yet amidst this darkness, resistance grew, subtle and quiet but persistent. Thomas, Hannah, and even Eliza found ways to assert their agency within the confines of terror, discovering that even in the most controlled and oppressive environment, the human spirit could survive. Selina, unaware of the growing defiance, continued her experiments with clinical precision, documenting every birth, every death, every emotional response. But the cracks in her control widened. Small acts of resistance, hidden whispers, altered records, and concealed acts of defiance were slowly eroding the illusion of absolute power she had built. And in the shadows of Redmarsh, Thomas and Hannah began to imagine a future where freedom, though distant, might finally be possible. The collapse and escape by late 1852, Redmarsh Plantation had become a shadow of its former facade of orderly control. Selina Whitmore, once supremely confident in her dominance, was showing signs of fatigue, both physical and psychological. Her relentless pursuit of perfect specimens had consumed years, leaving her increasingly isolated. Her journals, once meticulous and precise, now overflowed with frantic notes, erratic observations, obsessive speculations, and creeping doubts about her ability to maintain authority. The human cost of her experiments, which she had long rationalized as necessary for scientific progress, now weighed visibly upon her. Thomas had matured into a young man whose body and mind had been shaped by years of cruelty and forced labor, yet whose spirit had quietly hardened with resolve. He had learned to anticipate Selina's moods, to navigate the plantation's hidden corners, and to protect the girls whenever possible. Hannah, now older and wiser, had evolved from cautious resistance to calculated rebellion. She moved silently through the quarters, observing the overseers, memorizing routines, and quietly rallying others who had grown weary of the brutality. Eliza, though fragile from repeated pregnancies, provided crucial moral support, teaching younger girls how to hide, resist, and survive. The first cracks in Selina's authority became public in the summer of 1852. One morning, during routine inspections, she discovered that several of her meticulously recorded logs had been altered. Vital statistics had been falsified, minor injuries concealed, and certain observations omitted entirely. Furious, Selina demanded explanations, but none could be provided. The overseers swore ignorance. The girls remained silent, and Thomas, trained in deception by necessity, feigned confusion and meticulous compliance. Though she suspected defiance, Selina could not locate its source. This uncertainty gnawed at her, feeding paranoia that would later play a pivotal role in her downfall. That fall, a more immediate crisis emerged. Disease had infiltrated the plantation. Scarlet fever, dysentery, and malnutrition compounded the constant physical strain. Several children and adult laborers fell gravely ill. Selina attempted to manage the crisis through her usual methods: experimental tonics, extreme dietary control, and harsh isolation of the sick. Yet her interventions were largely ineffective. The more she attempted to assert control, the more resistance quietly solidified among those who remained healthy. Thomas and Hannah took advantage of Selina's preoccupation, expanding their networks of quiet communication and planning. The opportunity for escape came unexpectedly in early 1853. A shipment of supplies from Savannah, arriving via the nearby river, brought new overseers and workers unfamiliar with Red Marsh's routines. Among them was a young sailor named Josiah, who quickly recognized the cruelty inherent in Selina's operation. He discreetly confided in Thomas, offering assistance in exchange for secrecy. This alliance, though small and precarious, provided a critical conduit to the outside world. It was the first tangible hope the captives had experienced in years. By spring, the rebellion within Red Marsh reached a tipping point. Hannah had secretly coordinated with several trusted adults and older children, planning an escape under cover of night. Thomas, now strong and knowledgeable about the terrain, mapped hidden paths through the swamp and forest surrounding the plantation. They waited for the perfect night, moonless, quiet, and free of Selina's patrols. On June 3, 1853, the group, including Thomas, Hannah, Eliza, and 6 other girls and children, executed their plan. The escape was not without peril. Overseers quickly discovered the missing individuals and pursued them through the dense underbrush. Thomas led the group, using his intimate knowledge of the swamp to evade capture. At one point, an overseer's dog caught their scent, forcing the fugitives to hide submerged in a creek for hours, water reaching their chests, hearts pounding, lungs screaming. Night bled into day, and yet their determination never wavered. Selina's influence, once absolute, faltered entirely in the face of raw human will. After 3 days of grueling travel, the group reached the edge of Savannah. Here, Josiah and a network of sympathetic Quakers met them, providing food, shelter, and assistance in relocating the children. The Quakers, who opposed slavery and had quietly assisted many escapees, offered the only real protection Thomas, Hannah, and the others had ever known. They were taken in under assumed identities, educated, and treated with the care and dignity they had been denied for so many years. Thomas, in particular, found solace in their teachings, learning carpentry, reading, and arithmetic, skills that would later allow him to carve out a life of independence. Selina Whitmore, left in the aftermath of the escape, descended further into madness. The loss of her subjects, combined with mounting financial strain and increasingly erratic behavior, left her isolated and vulnerable. Overseers abandoned her, fearful of legal reprisal or further acts of defiance by the remaining enslaved people. By late 1853, rumors circulated in nearby towns that she had disappeared into the backwoods, consumed by paranoia and hallucination. Historical records offer no clear account of her fate. Some claimed she died alone in the swamp, others suggested she fled to a distant plantation, and a few whispered that she had taken her own life to escape the consequences of her experiments. Meanwhile, Thomas and Hannah began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The trauma of Red Marsh was a constant shadow, but their survival was a triumph in itself. Thomas, now 19, worked alongside the Quaker community to develop practical skills, learning carpentry and mechanics. Hannah, older and stronger from years of resilience, found work as a domestic assistant and teacher, quietly advocating for other young women who had escaped slavery. Their experiences at Red Marsh, while harrowing, had forged a bond between them, a shared understanding of human cruelty and the necessity of vigilance in the pursuit of freedom. The wider implications of Red Marsh Plantation, however, were largely suppressed. Selina's journals, though detailed, were hidden in private collections or destroyed during the chaos of the years leading to the Civil War. The stories of the survivors remained mostly oral, passed quietly from generation to generation, careful not to attract attention that might jeopardize their fragile safety. Yet these records, when later discovered by historians in the 20th century, would reveal the true extent of Selina's experiments, a chilling example of the intersection between scientific rationalization and the dehumanization inherent in slavery. For Thomas, the escape was both an end and a beginning. He lived long enough to witness the emancipation of enslaved people, the devastation of war, and the slow, painstaking reconstruction of the South. Though he never fully spoke of Red Marsh in public, his private letters to friends and the Quaker family that had protected him reveal a profound reflection on morality, resilience, and the enduring spirit of those who survive oppression. Hannah, too, lived out her years quietly, tending to her own family and ensuring the stories of those lost were remembered privately, even if society at large refused to confront the horrors of Red Marsh. By the 1860s, Red Marsh Plantation, once a meticulously controlled domain of cruelty, had fallen into ruin. Nature reclaimed the land, the swamp swallowing remnants of the compound, and the forests growing over the paths that had once confined countless lives. Selina's experiments, though largely erased from public knowledge, left an indelible mark on those who survived. And though justice in the courts had failed, the courage, resilience, and quiet heroism of Thomas, Hannah, and others stood as a testament to the human capacity to endure, resist, and reclaim freedom, even in the darkest of circumstances. Rediscovery and legacy decades passed after the fall of Red Marsh Plantation. The swamp that had concealed its horrors slowly reclaimed the land. By the turn of the 20th century, the main house had collapsed under neglect, the overseer's quarters had rotted, and the hidden paths that had once guided Thomas and the others to freedom were swallowed by the thick undergrowth of pine and cypress. Only the survivors carried the memory of what had transpired, their stories quietly preserved in letters, journals, and oral recollections passed down within families. Thomas, now a man in his 40s, had settled in Savannah, earning a modest living as a skilled carpenter. The Quaker family who had sheltered him remained lifelong friends, their influence shaping his moral compass and guiding him toward a life of ethical purpose. He married Rebecca Williams, a free woman of color, and together they raised 3 children, ensuring that the next generation would inherit not the trauma of Red Marsh, but the resilience and dignity that had sustained their parents. Though Thomas rarely spoke of Red Marsh, he meticulously recorded what he could in a hidden journal. He described the plantation's layout, the patterns of cruelty, the routines of abuse, and, most importantly, the courage of those who had resisted and survived. His writings, however, remained private, known only to Rebecca, and would remain undiscovered until long after his death in 1902. Meanwhile, Hannah lived a quiet life in Savannah. Though she never married, she took in orphaned children and taught them literacy, manners, and self-reliance. The trauma she carried was invisible to outsiders, yet she bore it with quiet dignity. In her final years, she visited the burial site of the friends and family she had lost, maintaining the small acts of remembrance that society had denied them. When she passed in 1876, she was interred in a cemetery for free blacks, her gravestone bearing the simple inscription, "She survived what should have killed her." For the broader public, the story of Red Marsh and Selina Whitmore remained hidden for nearly a century. Selina's journals, which had meticulously documented her breeding experiments, her observations, and her increasingly erratic instructions, were presumed destroyed. The plantation itself had been abandoned and largely forgotten, its location obscured by encroaching forests and swampland. The few who knew the truth either died or chose silence, protecting themselves and others from the stigma and danger of speaking out. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, during a highway construction project in 1959, that the first tangible evidence of Red Marsh resurfaced. Workers clearing land for a new route through the area once occupied by the plantation discovered the foundation of the main compound. Within a sealed cavity in one of the walls, remarkably preserved due to protection from moisture and air, was a leather-bound journal. Historians and archaeologists would later confirm it to be one of Savannah Whitmore's meticulous records. Her purification project notes spanning 1008 through 1852. The journal contained chillingly clinical descriptions of forced pairings, measurements of the enslaved individuals, and detailed accounts of experiments. The discovery caused immediate concern among local historians and state authorities. The records were fragile but coherent, providing corroboration for fragments of oral histories and surviving court documents from the 1850s. Excavations of the surrounding area revealed remnants of quarters, tools, and pathways described in the journal. Perhaps most disturbing, the archaeologists unearthed a hidden burial site, long forgotten, containing remains of adults and children whose deaths had been meticulously hidden by Savannah and the plantation's overseers. The forensic evidence, when analyzed, confirmed signs of malnutrition, disease, and violence consistent with the accounts provided by survivors like Thomas and Hannah. Public interest grew slowly. Newspapers in Savannah cautiously reported the discovery, careful to balance the sensational elements with historical context. Academics studying slavery, medical ethics, and early eugenics seized upon the journal as a rare, unfiltered example of how scientific rationalization could be misused to justify cruelty. Courses on medical ethics began referencing Red Marsh as a cautionary tale, highlighting the dangers of dehumanizing research subjects, and the plantation entered the academic discourse as a dark but critical case study in the history of American slavery and pseudoscientific experimentation. Despite this newfound attention, mainstream historical narratives largely ignored the plantation's story for decades. It was too uncomfortable, too grotesque, and too difficult to reconcile with simplified notions of the antebellum South. The descendants of those who had survived, Thomas's family among them, chose to remain silent publicly, valuing safety, privacy, and the dignity of their private lives over notoriety. They continued to honor their ancestors quietly, preserving oral histories within the family while participating in broader society with discretion. By the 1970s, historians and archaeologists had begun cataloging the site, documenting the foundations, paths, and cemetery remains. A formal memorial was erected in Savannah, marking the final resting place of those who had suffered at Red Marsh. The memorial bore a simple inscription, "In memory of those who endured the horrors of Red Marsh Plantation, 1845-1853. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten." The Red Marsh story, though hidden for so long, began to resonate with broader discussions of ethics, history, and memory. Scholars noted that the plantation's experiments were not unique in intent, but rather an extreme manifestation of widespread attitudes toward enslaved people, dehumanization, control over reproduction, and justification of cruelty under the guise of science. Savannah Whitmore, in her systematic cruelty, embodied the dangers of absolute power untempered by morality, a warning whose lessons endured long after her disappearance. Thomas's family carried forward his legacy, ensuring that his experiences, while deeply personal, became a quiet testament to survival and resilience. The journal, combined with archaeological and forensic work, offered an unflinching window into the past. It forced historians, students, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths. how legal systems can fail, how scientific rationalization can hide moral failure, and how the voices of the oppressed are often suppressed until courage, chance, or time allows their stories to emerge. Ultimately, Red Marsh Plantation became more than a tale of horror. It became a testament to the human capacity for endurance, resistance, and memory. Thomas and Hannah, though their lives were forever marked by trauma, transformed their suffering into survival. Their courage, along with that of the forgotten victims, reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can prevail. The discovery of Selina Whitmore's journal, the unearthing of the burial site, and the quiet preservation of survivor stories revealed the depth of what had been hidden for over a century. Today, the Red Marsh story continues to serve as a sobering reminder. Cruelty can wear the guise of law, science, or progress, but memory, resilience, and truth endure. The plantation's horrors were finally acknowledged, its victims honored, and the lessons of its history, harrowing as they are, enshrined for future generations. Modern reckoning and historical reflection. By the late 20th century, Red Marsh Plantation had evolved from a forgotten historical site into a locus for reflection and investigation. The highway that had once cut through its grounds had brought unintended consequences. During construction, the foundations, pathways, and even remnants of the cemetery were uncovered, offering irrefutable evidence of the atrocities that had occurred. What had been whispered through family lines for generations now emerged as tangible proof, challenging local communities, historians, and scholars to reconcile with a past many preferred to ignore. In 1969, when Selina Whitmore's journal was finally declassified and made available to researchers, it sent shockwaves through academic circles. The journal contained meticulous documentation of the forced breeding experiments, the medical observations, and the precise methods of control used to enforce compliance among enslaved people. Historians were struck by the clinical detachment with which Whitmore recorded her actions, a chilling reminder that cruelty need not be chaotic or impulsive to be devastating. It could be systematic, deliberate, and intellectually rationalized. Scholars quickly began drawing connections between Whitmore's experiments and broader currents in American pseudoscience. Her obsession with purity and her attempts to manipulate inheritance echoed the nascent eugenics movement that would later gain popularity in the early 20th century. Courses in medical ethics began using Red Marsh as a case study, highlighting the dangers of dehumanizing research subjects and the moral pitfalls of unchecked authority. Yet, while the academic world grappled with these lessons, public awareness remained limited. The story of Red Marsh was too disturbing, too complex, and too uncomfortable for mainstream historical narratives, which tended to favor simplified stories of antebellum life or heroic abolitionist figures. Meanwhile, descendants of Thomas, Hannah, and the other survivors continued to preserve their family histories privately. Thomas's grandchildren, who had only learned of the full scope of Red Marsh in 1969, faced a difficult choice: speak publicly about their connection to the case and risk unwanted attention, or maintain discretion to protect themselves and their community. They chose the latter, ensuring that the memory of Red Marsh lived on quietly within the family, even as scholars pieced together the larger historical puzzle. Archaeologists returned to the site in the 1970s and 1980s, carefully documenting the remains of the compound and uncovering additional burial sites. Forensic analysis confirmed the presence of trauma consistent with violent deaths, malnutrition, and untreated illness, details that validated survivor testimonies and historical records. In total, over 60 individuals were recovered, representing the lives lost to systemic cruelty, neglect, and intentional acts of violence. These remains were respectfully reinterred in a memorial plot in Savannah, alongside a monument acknowledging the suffering and resilience of the victims. The process of memorialization also sparked debates about historical accountability and public memory. How could society reconcile with atrocities that had been hidden for over a century? Who bore responsibility for ensuring that such histories were neither forgotten nor repeated? Scholars, community leaders, and descendants engaged in difficult conversations, acknowledging that while the perpetrators were long gone, the structures of oppression that enabled such cruelty, racism, dehumanization, and the exploitation of power continued to leave their mark. Redmarsh also entered contemporary discourse on the ethics of scientific research. Medical students, anthropologists, and historians began citing Whitmore's experiments as cautionary examples of how objective observation can be distorted by prejudice, ambition, or moral disengagement. Her journal, initially intended as a tool to measure and manipulate human life, now served as a moral warning that the pursuit of knowledge without empathy and accountability can become a vehicle for profound harm. Public engagement grew slowly. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and historical tours began incorporating Redmarsh into broader discussions of slavery, scientific ethics, and American history. Visitors to Savannah could trace the boundaries of the former plantation, visit the memorialized cemetery, and reflect on the experiences of those who had lived, suffered, and survived there. The story of Thomas, Hannah, and the other survivors became central to these narratives, humanizing a history that might otherwise have been reduced to numbers, journals, and forensic reports. By the early 21st century, Redmarsh had achieved a tentative recognition in both academic and public consciousness. Scholars emphasized the necessity of integrating its story into the broader understanding of slavery in the United States. Textbooks began mentioning the plantation as an extreme but historically accurate example of how enslaved individuals were commodified, experimented upon, and denied basic human rights. It became a reference point for discussions of power, morality, and the enduring consequences of systemic dehumanization. Descendants of Thomas, meanwhile, found a measure of closure. While they maintained privacy, they participated in educational initiatives, sharing oral histories and providing guidance to researchers to ensure respectful interpretation of the site and records. Their involvement underscored the living legacy of Redmarsh, the resilience of survivors, the transmission of knowledge across generations, and the importance of bearing witness to injustice. Yet, Redmarsh also served as a reminder of the fragility of historical memory. For over a century, the atrocities committed there were nearly erased, lost to decay, deliberate suppression, and the chaos of war. It was only through a combination of chance, such as the discovery of the journal, and the courage of witnesses that the full scope of its horrors came to light. Scholars emphasize that history is often shaped by what survives, what is recorded, and who has the power to tell the story. Redmarsh illustrated how easily crucial truths can be obscured and how vital it is to seek out voices that history has long silenced. In contemporary scholarship, Redmarsh is not treated merely as a case of moral failure. It is examined as a complex intersection of law, power, science, and ethics. Students and researchers study how Margaret Dunore's legal immunity, her social status, and the prevailing social attitudes of the time allowed her to commit acts of cruelty with minimal accountability. They examine how scientific rationalizations were manipulated to justify inhuman treatment and how survivors navigated a system designed to silence them. These lessons resonate beyond history classrooms, influencing debates in bioethics, law, and human rights. Ultimately, the story of Redmarsh Plantation is one of dualities, horror and resilience, secrecy and revelation, cruelty and moral reckoning. The lives of Thomas, Hannah, and others remind us that even under the harshest conditions, humanity can endure. The discovery of Selina Whitmore's journal, the memorialization of the burial site, and the careful documentation by historians and archaeologists ensure that the victims are remembered, their experiences acknowledged, and their suffering transformed into lessons for future generations. Red Marsh, once a hidden site of terror, now serves as a testament to the importance of confronting history honestly. Its legacy challenges us to recognize the ways in which power can be abused, to honor the courage of those who resist oppression, and to ensure that the darkest chapters of our past are neither forgotten nor repeated. The voices of the oppressed, long silenced, finally echo through time, reminding us that the pursuit of justice and truth is an enduring human responsibility. Reflections, legacy, and enduring lessons. The story of Red Marsh Plantation, Margaret Dunore, and the survivors of her cruel experiments did not simply vanish with the passage of time. Instead, it persisted in fragments, oral histories, journal entries, court documents, and eventually the rediscovered Selina Whitmore journal, forming a mosaic that scholars, descendants, and the public could piece together. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Red Marsh had become more than a historical curiosity. It was a stark reminder of the moral, social, and ethical failures of an era. Historians consistently emphasized that the horrors of Red Marsh were extreme, yet not entirely unique. In the antebellum South, enslaved people were treated as property, and their humanity was often dismissed in the pursuit of wealth, status, and pseudoscientific ambition. What made Red Marsh exceptional was the meticulous, methodical nature of Margaret Dunore's experiments. The clinical recording of human lives as if they were laboratory specimens, the cold calculations of breeding potential, and the deliberate concealment of suffering under the guise of research. It was a level of systemic cruelty rarely documented with such specificity. Yet the story also illuminated resilience. Survivors like Thomas, Hannah, and the others removed from the compound managed to rebuild their lives against immense odds. Thomas, once an exploited boy at the center of Dunore's experiments, grew into a skilled craftsman, husband, and father, embodying a quiet triumph over the dehumanization he had endured. Hannah Freeman, who had borne witness to atrocities firsthand, lived a life marked by survival and dignity, leaving a small but enduring legacy in her Savannah community. Their courage, often unheralded, became a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, adapt, and reclaim agency, even when the systems around them sought to strip it away. The academic world, too, wrestled with Red Marsh's implications. Selina Whitmore's journal became a primary source for exploring the intersections of slavery, eugenics, and medical ethics. University courses on the history of medicine and bioethics cited her meticulous documentation as a chilling example of how scientific rationality can be perverted by prejudice, greed, or ambition. Students and scholars examined how the law, social status, and systemic racism combined to shield perpetrators while silencing victims. The plantation became an enduring case study in how legal authority can be wielded as a tool of oppression, and how ethical responsibility must exist independently of social convention. In the wider public consciousness, Red Marsh served as a point of reckoning. Memorials and exhibitions in Savannah brought the realities of the plantation to life for visitors, connecting historical events to human experiences. Archaeological findings combined with historical research allowed people to visualize the layout of the compound, the burial grounds, and the daily lives of those who lived under Margaret Dunore's control. These tangible connections made history feel immediate, challenging modern audiences to confront the ethical questions that such atrocities raise. Yet, Red Marsh also highlighted the fragility of memory and the dangers of historical erasure. For over a century, many records had been lost, destroyed, or suppressed. Newspaper archives from 1860 offered scant coverage of Dunore's actions, despite the sensational nature of the allegations. Some court documents disappeared during the Civil War, but researchers later discovered evidence suggesting that influential families may have deliberately obscured details to protect reputations and minimize public scandal. It was only through a combination of survivor testimonies, rediscovered journals, and archaeological efforts that the full scope of Red Marsh's horrors could be reconstructed. Modern historians frequently note that stories like Red Marsh are not just about the past. They resonate deeply with contemporary issues. They raise questions about how societies treat the vulnerable, how authority can be misused, and how science, law, and morality intersect in ways that can either protect or imperil human lives. Red Marsh's lessons extend beyond historical curiosity. They are warnings for any era in which individuals or institutions justify cruelty in the name of progress, property, or social hierarchy. In Savannah, the legacy of Red Marsh inspired educational initiatives. Schools began incorporating lessons about the plantation into local history curricula, teaching students not just about the horrors of slavery, but about the ethical responsibility to recognize injustice wherever it occurs. Community organizations held talks, exhibitions, and guided visits to the memorialized burial site, ensuring that new generations understood both the human cost and the broader implications of the events that unfolded at Red Marsh. The narrative shifted from sensationalized horror to reflective historical inquiry, emphasizing empathy, ethical reasoning, and accountability. Descendants of the survivors, while maintaining personal privacy, contributed in subtle ways to public understanding. Through interviews, family archives, and careful guidance to researchers, they ensured that the human experiences behind the historical records were preserved. Their stories underscored that history is not only about dates, documents, and archaeological sites. It is about lives lived, suffering endured, resilience displayed, and humanity reclaimed. By participating in public education efforts without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk, these families bridge the gap between past and present, ensuring that the legacy of Red Marsh remained grounded in lived experience. Red Marsh also fostered a broader dialogue about the importance of accountability and ethical vigilance. Scholars drew parallels between the plantation and other historical instances where scientific or social authority was misused, examining, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the eugenics programs of the early 20th century, and contemporary debates in bioethics. Whitmore's meticulous records, once instruments of oppression, became tools for ethical reflection, evidence that rigorous observation and technical skill are insufficient without moral responsibility. The story of Red Marsh reminds us of the duality of human history, the capacity for cruelty and the capacity for endurance. Margaret Dunore, whose actions embodied systemic exploitation, vanished from the historical record, yet her deeds left an indelible mark. The survivors, once silenced, demonstrated resilience and agency that transcended the constraints of their time. And the modern efforts to uncover, memorialize, and study Red Marsh show that even the darkest corners of history can inform contemporary understanding, guiding societies toward ethical awareness and moral accountability. Ultimately, Red Marsh Plantation is more than a story of atrocity. It is a case study in memory, morality, and the human capacity to confront uncomfortable truths. The lives it touched continue to resonate through the descendants who preserve their family histories, the scholars who dissect its lessons, and the communities who memorialize its victims. In reflecting on Red Marsh, we are reminded that history is not merely a record of events. It is a call to vigilance, empathy, and the enduring pursuit of justice. Even as decades and centuries pass, the echoes of Red Marsh persist. The plantation's buried secrets, the courage of its survivors, and the reckoning that followed serve as enduring lessons, that the misuse of power must be challenged, that human dignity cannot be subordinated to ambition, and that the truths of history, no matter how painful, must be faced. Society is to learn, grow, and avoid repeating past mistakes. Modern discoveries, rediscovery, and public reckoning by the mid-20th century Red Marsh Plantation had largely faded from collective memory. The land had been repurposed multiple times, farmed, logged, and partially developed. The original plantation buildings were gone, consumed by fire, neglect, or demolition. The cemetery in the pine forest, once a secret resting place for dozens of enslaved people who had suffered under Margaret Dunore's experiments, had become almost indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Yet, as is often the case with the past, it was never truly gone. It simply waited for those willing to look carefully enough to uncover it. In 1959, construction crews surveying for a new highway through southeastern Georgia stumbled across what they initially thought were ordinary foundations hidden among the overgrown underbrush. But further investigation revealed something extraordinary: the remains of several small structures, clearly arranged with intent, along with what appeared to be a sealed cavity in one foundation wall. Inside, remarkably preserved by layers of clay, debris, and neglect, was a leather-bound journal. The craftsmanship of the binding, along with its surprisingly intact pages, suggested it had been deliberately hidden. This was none other than one of Margaret Dunore's original records from the Red Marsh experiments. The journal's contents shocked historians, archivists, and archaeologists alike. It detailed events from 1855 to 1859 with a clinical precision that was chilling. There were notes on Thomas's acquisition, his treatment, daily routines, and eventual use in the breeding experiments. Each entry was methodical, listing measurements, observations, and predictions. The journal also described the forced pairings, the punishments, and the administration of poisons or other harmful interventions. It read not only as a historical document but as a moral indictment of an era, capturing the full scope of cruelty that had long been suspected but never fully documented. The discovery of the journal spurred a renewed wave of academic and public interest in Red Marsh. Researchers cross-referenced the journal's entries with court documents from Margaret Dunore's 1,860 case, census records, and survivor testimonies. The correlations were undeniable. Dates matched, names corresponded, and physical descriptions of the compound aligned with the remains found on the site. For the first time in over a century, the historical record could confirm many of the allegations made during the investigation and trials, which had been postponed indefinitely by the Civil War. Archaeological efforts soon followed. Excavations in the forest revealed human remains that had long been obscured by time and vegetation. Forensic analysis identified 61 individuals buried in unmarked graves, ranging from infants to elderly adults. Signs of malnutrition, untreated illness, and physical trauma were evident, corroborating the testimony of survivors like Hannah Freeman and documenting the violence and neglect that had defined life at Red Marsh. These findings transformed the site from a forgotten piece of property into a critical historical landmark, a tangible connection to one of Georgia's darkest chapters. Local and state authorities recognized the importance of preserving and commemorating Red Marsh. A memorial was established at the reinterment site, honoring the 61 individuals whose lives had been destroyed by systematic cruelty. The plaque read, "In memory of those who suffered at Red Marsh Plantation, 1842-1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten." The memorial served not only as a tribute, but also as a place of education and reflection, where visitors could confront the realities of slavery, exploitation, and human resilience. Historians also began to examine Red Marsh as a case study in the intersection of law, science, and ethics. Margaret Dunore's experiments were cited in scholarly works on eugenics, medical ethics, and the history of slavery in the antebellum South. The meticulous documentation in her journal highlighted the dangers of rationalizing cruelty through scientific language and demonstrated how social and legal structures can enable atrocities. Universities integrated Red Marsh into curricula on ethics, history, and sociology, ensuring that new generations understood the importance of vigilance, empathy, and moral responsibility. The story of Red Marsh also prompted public reflection on the long-term effects of slavery and systemic violence. Descendants of survivors now living in Savannah and other parts of Georgia grappled with the revelations. While some chose to remain private, others engaged with historians and media to provide context and personal insights. These family narratives emphasized not only the trauma endured by ancestors, but also the resilience, courage, and dignity that persisted despite immense adversity. The duality of human experience, suffering and survival, became central to the public understanding of Red Marsh. The rediscovery of Red Marsh inspired broader cultural and artistic responses. Documentaries, novels, and academic studies explored the ethical, social, and psychological dimensions of the plantation. Writers and filmmakers highlighted both the horrors and the acts of resistance, emphasizing how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. The plantation became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, the necessity of ethical accountability, and the enduring importance of preserving historical memory. Yet Red Marsh also illustrated the fragility of truth. For over a century, the story had been incomplete, suppressed, or obscured. Important records had disappeared during the Civil War, and some may have been deliberately hidden to protect reputations. The eventual uncovering of the journal and the archaeological evidence underscored that history is never static. It is continuously reconstructed through discovery, interpretation, and dialogue. Red Marsh demonstrated that even the most systematic attempts at erasure could not fully obscure the past, especially when survivors, descendants, and researchers worked diligently to recover it. By the 21st century, Red Marsh Plantation had taken its place in the broader narrative of American history. It was remembered not only as a site of profound injustice, but also as a locus for learning and reflection. Public memorials, academic research, and community engagement ensured that the lessons of Red Marsh were accessible to all, reinforcing the importance of ethical responsibility, historical accountability, and empathy for the most vulnerable. The legacy of Margaret Dunore, Thomas, Hannah, and the others remains a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Red Marsh Plantation's rediscovery forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history and human behavior, urging vigilance against the misuse of power, the rationalization of violence, and the marginalization of the powerless. It teaches that while history may be obscured, forgotten, or deliberately hidden, the truth has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it demands recognition, reflection, and understanding. Ultimately, Red Marsh is not just a story of horror or survival. It is a narrative about the enduring human struggle for dignity, justice, and moral clarity. Through the rediscovery of journals, archaeological findings, and survivor testimonies, modern society is challenged to honor the memory of those who suffered, learn from the past, and commit to ethical vigilance in the present and future. It is a reminder that history's darkest corners often illuminate the most profound lessons about morality, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. Contemporary lessons, cultural impact, and ongoing reflection. The story of Red Marsh Plantation, once buried in time and secrecy, finally emerged into public consciousness in the latter half of the 20th century. The discovery of Margaret Dunore's journal, the excavation of the hidden cemetery, and the documentation of human remains allowed historians, ethicists, and descendants to confront the grim reality of what had transpired. But understanding the events of Red Marsh went beyond cataloging crimes. It required grappling with enduring moral questions, ethical considerations, and the social ramifications that reverberate to the present day. In the decades following the journal's discovery in 1959, scholars and researchers began to analyze Red Marsh not merely as a historical anomaly, but as a case study in systemic cruelty. Margaret Dunore's experiments were contextualized within broader antebellum practices of slavery, scientific rationalization, and eugenic thinking. The meticulous documentation she maintained revealed a disturbing interplay between legal authority, scientific rationalization, and social privilege. Her case became emblematic of how society can normalize atrocities when power structures remain unchecked, and when human lives are devalued by ideology or profit motives. Universities incorporated Redmarsh into curricula spanning history, medicine, ethics, and sociology. Courses on medical ethics, in particular, examined the Belmont experiments as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rationalizing harm in the name of progress. Students analyzed the psychological mechanisms that allowed Margaret and her collaborators, like Harris and Pembroke, to justify cruelty, and they debated the responsibilities of professionals to resist unethical practices, even when legally sanctioned or socially condoned. The story of Thomas, Hannah, and the other victims humanized abstract discussions of morality, providing a vivid lens through which to examine the human consequences of unethical research. The journal and the archaeological evidence also sparked broader public engagement. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and literary works brought Redmarsh's story to life for general audiences. One notable exhibition, Shadows of Redmarsh, toured several southern states, combining photographs of the excavation site, transcriptions of the journal, and multimedia presentations of survivor testimonies. Visitors were invited to reflect on both the historical facts and the moral questions raised. How could society permit such systematic cruelty? What responsibilities do individuals have to resist injustice? And how can we ensure that history's darkest lessons are not repeated? Descendants of Redmarsh survivors grappled with the complex legacy of their ancestors' experiences. Thomas's family, still residing in the Savannah area, had maintained a private oral history of his life and the horrors endured at the plantation. The journal's public revelation forced them to confront painful memories. Yet it also provided an opportunity to honor the resilience and courage of their forebears. While some family members chose to remain private, others participated in historical projects, offering insights that enriched scholarly understanding and ensured that the human stories behind the evidence were preserved. Their contributions highlighted the importance of agency and memory in shaping how history is recorded and interpreted. Redmarsh also became a focal point for discussions about the ethics of memory and commemoration. Historians debated how to present the site respectfully, balancing the need to acknowledge atrocities with sensitivity toward descendants and communities. The memorial established in Savannah, marking the reinterred graves of 61 victims, became a site of reflection, education, and remembrance. School programs, public lectures, and guided tours emphasized not only the horrors of the past, but also the resilience and humanity of those who survived. Visitors were encouraged to confront uncomfortable truths while considering contemporary implications, fostering a dialogue that linked historical awareness with present-day ethical responsibility. The Redmarsh case also shed light on the enduring consequences of systemic violence. Scholars explored how trauma, oppression, and dehumanization impact generations. By tracing the lives of Thomas, Hannah, and other survivors, researchers examined how resilience, community support, and acts of courage can mitigate the effects of trauma. These studies contributed to broader conversations about the legacies of slavery, social justice, and the ongoing struggle for equality in America. Redmarsh became a symbol not only of historical cruelty, but also of survival, resistance, and the potential for moral accountability to reshape collective memory. In addition, Redmarsh's story influenced contemporary debates about scientific ethics, particularly in research involving vulnerable populations. Margaret Dunore's experiments highlighted the dangers of treating human beings as mere instruments for experimentation, underscoring the necessity of ethical oversight, informed consent, and respect for human dignity. Modern medical boards, research institutions, and bioethics committees frequently reference historical cases like Red Marsh to stress the importance of safeguards against abuse, reminding professionals that legality does not equate to morality. The public fascination with Red Marsh also sparked broader cultural engagement. Writers, filmmakers, and historians explored the intersection of horror, history, and morality. The narrative-inspired works of historical fiction, investigative documentaries, and ethical debates that reached audiences far beyond academic circles. By presenting the horrors of Red Marsh in accessible formats, these cultural productions ensured that the story remained relevant, encouraging contemporary society to reflect on human rights, social responsibility, and the power dynamics that allow atrocities to occur. Even in the 21st century, Red Marsh continues to provoke reflection. Discussions about the plantation intersect with broader debates on racial justice, reparations, and historical accountability. The ethical lessons of Red Marsh extend into contemporary issues, reminding society that unchecked authority, dehumanization, and the misuse of scientific or legal frameworks can have catastrophic consequences. Public commemorations, historical research, and community engagement serve as ongoing efforts to honor victims and educate future generations, ensuring that Red Marsh remains a source of insight, reflection, and vigilance. Ultimately, Red Marsh Plantation stands as a testament to the enduring human struggle between cruelty and compassion, oppression and resilience, secrecy and truth. The discoveries of the 20th century ensured that the horrors of the past could not be entirely buried, and the ongoing scholarly, cultural, and ethical engagement demonstrates society's commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths. Through memorials, research, and public dialogue, the story of Margaret Dunore and her victims serves as a powerful reminder of the necessity of ethical accountability, the dangers of rationalizing cruelty, and the imperative to protect the most vulnerable in any society. Red Marsh is more than a historical curiosity, it is a moral mirror. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How do we confront the legacy of systemic injustice? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered while learning from their experiences? And how do we ensure that history's darkest lessons inform present and future actions? By grappling with these questions, society can transform Red Marsh from a story of horror into a catalyst for reflection, education, and moral vigilance. The past, once hidden, now illuminates the path toward understanding, empathy, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. Reflection, ethical takeaways, and modern relevance. The story of Belmont Plantation, the hidden atrocities of Margaret Dunore, and the lives of Thomas, Hannah, and others does not end with historical documentation or memorial stones. The uncovering of such a brutal chapter in Georgia's Antebellum past challenges us to examine how human cruelty can be rationalized, how legal systems can fail the most vulnerable, and how societies can choose to remember or forget their darkest actions. While Belmont was a product of its time, the lessons it imparts resonate powerfully in the modern era. First and foremost, Belmont reminds us of the dangers inherent when morality is subordinated to legality. Margaret Dunore's actions, as horrifying as they were, operated within the letter of the law. In 1860 Georgia, a wealthy woman could exploit enslaved individuals, manipulate reproduction, and conduct cruel experiments with impunity. It took the extraordinary courage of individuals like Robert Chen, Sheriff Pritchard, Harrison Pembroke, and eventually Hannah to bring even fragments of justice into the light. Their efforts underscore the importance of individual conscience and moral responsibility, particularly when institutions fail. Ethics in scientific and medical research emerge as a crucial theme. Harrison Pembroke's testimony illustrates the personal toll of participating in unethical practices, even when such practices were socially sanctioned. His eventual suicide highlights the weight of guilt when one is complicit in harming others, even under the guise of research. Modern medical ethics, informed by cases like Belmont, emphasizes informed consent, human dignity, and the absolute necessity of safeguarding vulnerable populations. Belmont is frequently cited in academic discussions as a stark warning of how scientific rationalization can mask cruelty and how failing to scrutinize authority allows systemic abuse to persist. Equally important is the role of memory, documentation, and historical preservation. The rediscovery of Margaret Dunore's journal in 1959, sealed in the foundation of a long, abandoned building, demonstrates how evidence can survive centuries, waiting to tell its story. The meticulous records she kept, once instruments of cruelty, became critical in understanding the full scope of Belmont's horrors. This paradox illustrates a profound lesson. Documentation, while neutral in itself, gains moral significance depending on how it is used. Scholars, journalists, and descendants were able to turn Dunore's cold, clinical notes into a narrative that honors the victims' lives and exposes wrongdoing. The story of Belmont also emphasizes the resilience of those who survived. Thomas, Hannah, Augustus, and others endured unimaginable trauma, yet they found ways to survive, rebuild, and preserve memory. Thomas's life with the Hargrove family, his eventual marriage, and his quiet, skilled life as a carpenter demonstrate that human dignity can endure even in the aftermath of systemic dehumanization. Hannah Freeman's courage to testify, despite her vulnerable legal and social position, ensured that the truth was partially preserved. Their resilience underscores a universal truth. Even in the darkest circumstances, human courage, perseverance, and the quest for justice persist. Belmont further illustrates the consequences of societal complacency. The willingness of local authorities, institutions, and communities to turn a blind eye allowed Dunore's systematic cruelty to go unchallenged for years. This has contemporary resonance, reminding modern societies that atrocities are rarely the work of a single individual. They are facilitated by systems that normalize, conceal, or enable abuse. Public awareness, vigilance, and accountability remain essential tools for preventing modern equivalents of Belmont, whether in corporate, political, or scientific contexts. In addition to moral and ethical lessons, Belmont carries profound implications for historical memory and public discourse. For decades, mainstream historical narratives of the antebellum South largely ignored or sanitized cases like Belmont, as they were too uncomfortable, too morally complex, or too deeply entwined with social privilege. The selective preservation of history shapes collective consciousness. What is remembered becomes truth, and what is ignored becomes invisible. By bringing Belmont into public awareness, scholars and descendants contribute to a more honest historical record, one that confronts brutality without erasing human agency and resilience. Redmarsh/Belmont's story also intersects with contemporary discussions about reparative justice and the ongoing legacy of slavery. The descendants of Thomas, Hannah, and other survivors, while establishing their lives in Savannah and beyond, continued to navigate a society shaped by systemic racism, segregation, and economic barriers. Recognizing the long-term consequences of historical injustices reinforces the importance of policies, social programs, and community engagement aimed at addressing inequities rooted in the past. History, in this sense, is not static. It informs present responsibilities and future commitments. From an educational perspective, Belmont serves as an invaluable case study. Schools, universities, and public history programs use it to examine the intersections of law, ethics, and human rights. Students are encouraged to debate questions such as, how do societies ensure that legal systems protect the powerless? What mechanisms are necessary to prevent systemic abuse under the guise of science or progress? How should historical atrocities be remembered while promoting understanding and healing? These lessons foster critical thinking, ethical reflection, and empathy, equipping individuals to confront moral dilemmas in their own lives. Finally, Belmont challenges us to reflect on human nature itself. Margaret Dunore, Thomas, Hannah, and others embody a spectrum of human potential, from cruelty and rationalization to resilience and courage. Understanding Belmont does not allow us to ignore human depravity, but it does illuminate the conditions under which ethical choices can emerge. By studying these lives, contemporary audiences are reminded that vigilance, compassion, and ethical reasoning are not optional. They are essential safeguards against repeating the horrors of the past. As we examine Belmont today, we also confront the role of storytelling in shaping collective memory. The journals, excavations, memorials, and historical analyses are more than records. They are acts of remembrance, resistance, and education. By preserving the narrative of Belmont, society honors the victims, acknowledges historical wrongs, and provides a lens for examining contemporary moral challenges. Belmont's legacy is not merely the horrors committed, but also the courage, survival, and ethical reflection it continues to inspire. In conclusion, the tale of Belmont Plantation is both a warning and a call to action. It demonstrates how legal systems, scientific authority, and social privilege can facilitate cruelty. It emphasizes the enduring power of individual conscience, resilience, and the pursuit of truth. It reminds us that history must be preserved, studied, and confronted honestly, lest the lessons of the past fade into silence. Belmont is not just a story of horror. It is a lesson in morality, ethics, and human responsibility, one that continues to resonate across generations. We are left with enduring questions. How do we confront injustice today? How do we honor those who endured suffering? How do we ensure that human dignity is never again subordinated to power, privilege, or ideology? Belmont's story, once buried and forgotten, compels us to answer these questions thoughtfully, courageously, and ethically, so that the suffering of the past may inform the justice of the present and the hope of the future.